What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Primetime Sports Podcast, hosted by Joey Malari. So I haven't done an episode in the radio studio here at WZBC since it was March 2nd of 2024. So March 2nd to obviously now it's January 2nd. So we're looking at 10 months ago was the last time I was live here in the studio. To be a quick episode, just have a few minutes before the BC women's basketball game against Duke. So I want to talk some things about baseball really quick for the next 10 to 15 minutes. Very nice to be back in the studio. This is something, as I said, I haven't done now in 10 months. So really nice to get back in here and talk sports. I haven't really been able to do too many episodes on my podcast in a long time just because I've been busy with football season and working here in the athletics department at BC. And then also now with classes as well, it's tough to really keep up with everything. So the podcast I haven't really been able to do as much as I wanted. And obviously the radio studio, I haven't been able to visit as much either. But hopefully I'll be able to do more of that in the future. Hopefully in the spring I'll be able to do that. So let's start out with some things in baseball really quick. And I haven't really done too much, as I said, over the past month. So lots happened. A lot of this news you guys already probably know, I'd imagine. So the first one we'll start with is the Mets signing Juan Soto, 15 years, $765 million. Soto's contract, which actually could get up to $805 million based on a potential option that he could get, has no deferred money at all. So the Mets went all in and basically just signed the check for $765 million with none of it being deferred. So he'll be getting an average annual value there. Pretty hefty money of, what the Mets offered than what the Yankees offered. If you look what the Yankees offered, I think they were around 750 or something like that, but or 760 I think they finished at. But the Mets ended up giving him more money, and it seems like he felt like he wanted to go to the Mets anyways. He said like the Mets gave him a better chance to potentially win. So obviously that's hard for Yankees fans to hear, especially when the money wasn't that different. It was $760 million, I think, for $765. As I mentioned, he does have that potential opt-out, but $51 million in average annual value, all of that being straight up and not guaranteed. So he'll be getting $51 million of guaranteed money each year with none of it, none of it guaranteed. All of that being guaranteed, none of it being deferred. So the Mets got the guy they wanted, and they stole him from the crosstown rival Yankees. So that's definitely a big come up there for the New York Mets. Obviously, Steve Cohen opened up the checkbook and got the biggest free agent in baseball this year. And I think if you look at the payday he got, he doesn't really have much speed, not really the best defensive player, but his bat is so elite that the payday wasn't really surprising, especially considering the market and what guys are now getting in each sport. Just the salary caps going up each year in the NBA, NFL, and NHL. It's natural that contracts keep going up in those three respective sports. Baseball obviously doesn't have a salary cap or salary floor, but at the end of the day, with the more money that's coming in, it's really just natural guys are making more money. So it's not really too surprising to see. I think if you look at the Yankees, though, I think they reallocated their money very properly, honestly, if you look at it. I think a lot of people thought when they missed out on Soto, that was a really big miss, which at the end of the day, when you trade for Soto last year, the plan was for them to re-sign him at the end of the day, and that's not the way things went. Obviously, he went to New York, like I mentioned, going over crosstown to Queens to play for the Mets. But I think the Mets, obviously getting him, that was their main goal. The Yankees' goal was to re-sign him as well, but the Yankees were able to take that money that they were going to give him, and they reallocated it, as I said, in a very, very great way. I think when you sign a guy like Max Fried, you sign a guy like Cody Bellinger, you trade for Cody Bellinger, you sign a guy like Paul Goldschmidt, and then trade for Devin Williams. I think this situation that the Yankees are in right now is a very similar situation to Paul George leaving the Clippers. Paul George was a free agent this past summer for the Clippers, and the Clippers had a big decision to make. Do they want to re-sign Paul George and bring him back on a 4-year deal, a max contract, or they rather reallocate that money and really fill out the rest of their roster and add a lot of depth? And the Clippers chose the latter part of that. They went out and they took that money they were going to give Paul George, rather than paying Paul George a max contract at 37 to 38 years old. They took that money they were going to give him and they reallocated it similarly to what the Yankees just did. They took that money rather than giving it to Paul George and they gave it to Derek Jones Jr., who I think is an excellent deal, 3 years, $30 million. Maybe my favorite player on the Clippers besides Bones Hyland. I'm a big Bones Hyland fan, but Bones Hyland is great, doesn't really play too much, unfortunately, but Derek Jones Jr. plays a ton and is a big, big piece. And a big reason the Clippers are in the position they're in right now in the Western Conference without a game out of Kawhi Leonard, Derek Jones Jr. has been great defensively and has been the guy the Clippers needed in that lineup to be a defensive anchor. I think if you look at the other guys they signed, Nick Batum, a great glue guy, Chris Dunn, very good defensive player, also scored a little bit the last couple weeks for the Clippers, which has been great. Kevin Porter Jr. has been very good offensively. He's had some down nights, but overall, you need a guy off the bench that can add a spark, and he's kind of been that option for them. And then Mo Bamba, the Clippers need to add a little bit more size and a little bit more, if you look at the way the Clippers were over the last 3 or 4 years, a very old lineup, an aging lineup. Now they went really young. They're looking at guys that are really young, like Chris Dunn, Mo Bamba, and Kevin Porter Jr., guys that are younger that will have obviously a lot more basketball left in them, not really going to get tired on a back-to-back. The Clippers the last few years have had really an aging roster. And at the end of the day, I wanted James Harden on the Clippers. I loved having Paul George with them and Russell Westbrook and Kawhi Leonard. And then you also added guys like PJ Tucker and Eric Gordon they had a few years ago, Reggie Jackson at one point, John Wall at one point. The Clippers have had a very old roster over the last few years, so it made sense for them to really go young this year and try to mix things up. So they reallocated that money very well in LA. I think the Yankees did a very similar role here in this offseason. As I said, you signed guys like Max Fried and Paul Goldschmidt, and then you also added a guy like Devin Williams and Cody Bellinger in trades. And I think that's a great offseason for the Yankees at the end of the day. Rather than having Juan Soto for that big contract, they were able to split up that money. And is Juan Soto a great player? Am I taking away from him by saying that they allocated the money in a better way? No, I'm not trying to take away from his talent, but the reality is when you don't sign him and you let him walk for all of that money, $760 million was the Yankees' final offer, and that was reported. I'm not really too sure if that ended up being it, but that's what a lot of the reports were. You're able to take that money and then split it up elsewhere. And you signed a guy with Paul Goldschmidt who has been a little bit on the downtrend, I think. He had 22 home runs last year, 245 batting average, 66 runs batted in, and a 716 OPS. His RBIs and his home runs over the last few years have been the lowest of his career. I think this past season in 2024, he had his career low in runs batted in and his career low in home runs over the last 10 years. So I think besides his rookie year and maybe one other year, a few years after that, he had career lows, this past year. So in the last 10 years, I said career low in runs batted in and home runs. This past season, he did win the MVP vote, though, in 2022, but he's not the same player that he was back then, I don't think. I saw that, I looked up his stats yesterday. His average, his home runs, his runs batted in have all dropped, along with his OPS. They've all dropped over the last 3 years, just straight down the line have fallen. So that's obviously tough. The Yankees are taking a gamble on him and hoping that he pans out. Max Fried, the guy that I wanted on the Red Sox, signed a major deal with the Yankees, getting an 8-year, $218 million deal with the Yankees. That's a great pickup. That's the biggest contract that a left-handed pitcher has ever gotten in Major League Baseball history. Let that sink in. The biggest contract a left-handed pitcher has ever gotten in Major League Baseball history. So it shows that the game is obviously, the contract's going up and up and up each year. So the game's growing at the end of the day. But I think you're seeing teams starting to value guys like Max Fried, who's been one of the best pitchers in baseball over the last 4 or 5 years. But I know the injury history has worried some people, but I think you look at the talent when he is playing and he's at his best, he's one of the best pitchers in the game of baseball. Since 2020, among lefties that are pitchers in baseball with 500 innings pitched, he's first in ERA with a 2.81 ERA, first in FIP, which I've mentioned before, is fielding independent pitching. So it's a stat that really just looks at what the pitcher's influence is on the game rather than looking at it from a defensive perspective, what his defense is doing. This is looking at it just based from what the pitcher can control, 3.11 FIP, and third in WHIP, which is walks and hits per inning pitched. He had a 1.09 WHIP with a 3.11 FIP and a 2.81 ERA. So excellent numbers all around there. As I said, this is a guy who wanted to be a Red Sox, getting a great payday from New York. He had a great year last year, 11-10 record in 2024, which ended up being a 3.25 ERA and a 3.33 FIP. Very good season overall for him. So the Yankees have had a good offseason. I know a lot of people look at the Juan Soto deal as a major loss, and I get that at the end of the day. They want to bring him back. But if you look at what they were able to do with that money, I think it's going to work out for the Yankees getting those 4 pieces there. And then trading for Devin Williams, who's the best closer in the game of baseball at times, and if he's not the best, he's maybe second best. I'd probably put him honestly at first right now, the way things stand. So they got the best closer in baseball, a guy that's going to really short things up for them in the 9th inning when they're leading. And then you also get a guy in Cody Bellinger, who had a little bit of a down year this year, but had a good rebounding year in 2023 with the Yankees after struggling, with the Cubs after struggling in LA in his last few years with the Dodgers. So good rebound year in 2023 with the Cubs, a down year a little bit in 2024, but I think this trade for the Yankees will end up being a good one there. I've always been a fan of Bellinger and his talent. You can still count on him to be a good player, and that's what the Yankees are doing here. They're hoping he turns out into the player he was 2 years ago with the Cubs, and I think at the end of the day, that's something you can count on. When you look at Cody Bellinger and his stats, the stats have been down probably a little bit the last few years, but I think if you look at pure talent, I think you can still count on him to give you production in your lineup. And the Yankees needed production. Anthony Rizzo was getting older the last few years. Now he's a free agent, but he was declining. DJ LeMay, he was declining. I thought Giancarlo Stanton was going to be declining the last few years, but he's had a good last few years for the Yankees. Last year was probably his best year over the last 3. So I thought he would be on the downtrend, but he's played pretty well. So we'll see what happens there for the Yankees and what they do the rest of the offseason. But I think if you look at what the Yankees have done overall, as I said, I think they've had a good offseason with everything being, included with Juan Soto leaving. They were able to recover pretty well. One other thing I want to mention here is Terry Francona returning to Major League Baseball. He'll be managing the Cincinnati Reds next season. He stepped down as Cleveland's manager in 2023 due to health reasons, and now he's going back to the game of baseball after taking a year off. He'll be back now, as I said, in Cincinnati, taking over a franchise with a lot of young talent, a team that was decimated by injuries last season and underperformed overall, but they do have a lot of talent. He did help guide Cleveland to their first postseason appearance in 6 years back in 2013. He's going to have to do a similar thing here with the Reds. They did make it in 2020, a COVID-shortened season, but they really haven't had much success. They haven't had much success over the last 10 years. So we'll see what happens there, but I do like that pickup there for Cincinnati. If you look at what they have there, Matt McClain, Ellie De La Cruz, Hunter Green, a lot of young talent there to work with, and I'm sure that Tito Francona will be able to do that, and help those guys perform at a high level. Another thing I want to mention, Chaim Bloom. He'll be taking over as the St. Louis Cardinals president of baseball operations after the 2025 baseball season ends. He signed a 5-year contract this past offseason to take over the role there. So after this season ends in 2025, this upcoming year, he'll be taking over as a president of baseball operations. And if you look at the Red Sox and where they currently stand, I know a lot of people talk about Chaim and his tenure, and they look at the Mookie Betts trade and look at some other moves. And I think at the end of the day, every single GM, doesn't matter the sport, they're going to have makes, they're going to have misses. That's a reality of the position. That's a reality of sports. Some guys don't pan out. Some guys in the right position. Some guys are the right pick, just not in the right spot. You look at Sam Darnold in New York. Didn't work out with the Jets. Didn't work out with Carolina. Went to San Francisco as the backup, and now is flourishing as a starting quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings. Sometimes it's a position you're in. I think the New York Giants got it right with Daniel Jones with that 6th overall draft pick in 2019. Not many people are going to say that. I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me, and that's fine at the end of the day. But I think if you look at Daniel Jones, I think he was in a really hard position. 3 head coaches over his 6 years with the Giants, 4 offensive coordinators, a really terrible offensive line, not really much to work with on offense when it comes to weapons. I know Saquon Barkley was with them for most of that tenure in New York, but at the end of the day, they didn't really give him a wide receiver 1 until his last year. They got Malik Nabers in the draft with a 6th overall pick this past April, which was a great draft pick. I'm a big fan of Malik Nabers, but I think if you look at Daniel Jones' tenure overall, I don't really blame him for everything. I think a lot of people blame Daniel Jones for the way things ended up. And I think if you look at it, there's 3 things I've been mentioning to a lot of my friends, and I just had this conversation on New Year's Eve with a couple of my friends, Mark Walsh, who I've had on this show, many times, so you guys know the name. I said Daniel Jones can't be blamed for these 3 things. Being drafted 6th overall, can't blame him for that. That's the New York Giants choosing to draft him 6th overall. He didn't choose to get drafted to the New York Giants. And thirdly, he didn't choose to sign that contract. At the end of the day, yes, he did put pen to paper and he did sign it. But I'm saying if you get offered that contract, 4 years, $160 million after a career year in 2022, and he had some injuries in the past, of course you're going to sign that deal. So you can't blame Daniel Jones for any of those 3 things, and I don't blame him for any of them, as I said. So like I mentioned, Daniel Jones, I think, was the right quarterback, just didn't work out in New York, just not the right surrounding pieces. And I think that can be the same here for Chaim Bloom with the Boston Red Sox. I think a lot of people look at his tenure and they say Chaim Bloom is a miss. Chaim Bloom set the Red Sox up for a lot of success in the future. I think if you look at this Red Sox team right now and their prospects, Chaim Bloom can be the guy to give credit for the Red Sox having a top 5 farm system in the game of baseball. When Chaim Bloom stepped in at the end of the 2019 season and took over the Red Sox had a bottom 3 farm system and one of the highest payrolls in baseball, and they were high in the luxury tax. And this was the Red Sox goal. The Red Sox goal when they hired Chaim Bloom was to lower the payroll, to get under the luxury tax, was to build the farm system, and still try to compete to win a world championship. And all 3 of those things, they're impossible to do all at once. That's just a reality. And I just wish the Red Sox gave Chaim Bloom more time. I don't think he was the issue in Boston. John Henry and ownership didn't want to spend the money that they were spending in years past. And at the end of the day, the media blamed Chaim Bloom. And that's why I think there was a lot of pressure on ownership to get rid of Chaim Bloom. But I wouldn't have done that. I think it took time for people to see, and I think people are starting to see it now, that Chaim Bloom really built this Red Sox farm system to set them up for sustained success in the future. And if you look at before the Garrett Crochet trade that the Red Sox just made over the past month, heading into this offseason, the Red Sox had 6 top 100 prospects in Major League Baseball. 6 top 100 prospects. Roman Anthony, who's 3rd overall, Marcelo Meyer, who's 7th overall, Christian Campbell, who's 10th overall, Kyle Till, who's 25th overall, Brady Montgomery, who was 54th overall before the trade, and then Franklin Arias, who is 95th overall. 5 of those guys were either drafted or signed by Chaim Bloom. The only guy that wasn't was Brady Montgomery, who was the Red Sox first-round pick in the 2024 MLB draft. So only if the Red Sox gave Chaim Bloom more time. Once again, I think he was the right guy. I believe he was the right guy. He was not given enough time. And I think that can be the same that's said about those other guys I mentioned. Daniel Jones, Sam Donald, they weren't really, given those pieces that were necessary to go out and win. And now they're in better positions. I mean, Daniel Jones isn't really a starter right now, but he's in Minnesota learning under Kevin O'Connell, who's a very good quarterbacks coach. Head coach there, obviously, but he's very good with quarterbacks. So I think Daniel Jones will probably learn a lot as the third-string quarterback as of right now in Minnesota. Maybe he'll end up being, the backup quarterback when the playoffs come, but we'll see. But I do think Daniel Jones could have been the right guy for the New York Giants, just like I think Chaim Bloom was the right guy for the Red Sox. But the reality is, situations that you can't control. Pressure from ownership, pressure from the media, not the right surrounding pieces, not enough time. Those are things you can't blame Chaim Bloom for or Daniel Jones at the end of the day. The surrounding pieces and obviously the way that the Red Sox didn't really want to spend over the last 5 years, those are circumstances that you really can't blame them for. But I think St. Louis is in a really good position with Chaim Bloom, and I'm excited to see what he does with the future of that franchise. And I think it shows a lot of respect in the game of baseball. The second the Red Sox let him go, ends up being an assistant to the president, John Mozeliak, in St. Louis, and now he ends up saying he's going to step down after this year's over, and Chaim Bloom's going to step in with a 5-year deal after the 2025 season ends. So it shows that he has a lot of respect in the industry. Didn't really take much time for him to get another job, and I'm not really too shocked by that. I think if you look at what he did in Boston, as I said, took a bottom 3 farm system and built it into a top 5 farm system in the game of baseball. And Jeff Passan said at the start of last season, the Red Sox farm system is more Orioles-like than they were being given credit for. And that's a lot of credit is due to Chaim Bloom. And now you see it. A lot of position plays that the Red Sox have, a lot of those position plays that I mentioned, Christian Campbell, and then Marcelo Meyer, Roman Anthony, all Chaim Bloom draft picks. Kyle Taylor was another Chaim Bloom draft pick who ended up getting traded in that deal with the Chicago White Sox. But at the end of the day, Chaim Bloom built this Red Sox team to win in the future. It just wasn't given enough time. But the Red Sox did make a major splash this offseason, and 2 guys I mentioned were big parts of that deal. Kyle Taylor and Brady Montgomery were traded to Chicago, and that's the White Sox, in exchange for Garrett Crochet. The White Sox received 4 of the Red Sox top 14 prospects. They got Brady Montgomery, who's 5th in the Red Sox farm system, 54th overall in Major League Baseball. Kyle Taylor, the 4th Red Sox prospect, and 25th in the MLB. And then Chase Mydroth, who is the Sox number 11 prospect. And then Wickelman Gonzalez, who's a right-handed pitcher in the Red Sox farm system as well, who I think is the 14th overall prospect, before this trade. Garrett Crochet in 2024, if you look at his numbers, he was very, very good. First in strikeouts per 9 innings, first in expected FIP, which I mentioned, as I said, fielding independent pitching. He was first in expected FIP, first in strikeout to walk percentage, and 6th in Fangraphs wins above replacement. He was first in whiff rate at 33.1%, so that's swings and misses. He was first in baseball, 35.1% in the strikeout rate, which is first in Major League Baseball, 31% whiff rate with all 5 of his pitches. He has a 31% whiff rate with all 5 of his pitches. So that's pretty impressive stuff. These are stats I got from Brian Barrett, who used to be on WEEI. And then he also has a 42.7% whiff rate in his sweeper. And has a fastball that gets up to 97 miles an hour. That's where it sits. It gets a little higher than that, but it sits around 97 miles an hour. So obviously all of those stats are great if you look at those numbers there. But my worries with this deal, Garrett Crochet was a first-year starter in 2024. He had an arm injury in 2022. Didn't play great in the second half of 2024. I think those 3 things right there I mentioned, which the arm injury, I mean, every single pitcher in the game of baseball has arm injuries. It's just the reality of the position now. Your body's really not meant to take throwing 100 pitches a game at 97 plus miles an hour, especially with all of the pressure and emphasis that's put on spin rate. Your elbow, your shoulder, they're really not meant to take those things. Your shoulder and your elbow are not meant to take all of that pressure and all that force, with every single pitch that you have to throw. So that's not really too surprising with the arm injury, and obviously it's unfortunate, but as I said, the Major League Baseball, the trend in pitching in Major League Baseball has been, pitchers are going to get hurt at some point. And that's just an unfortunate thing, but as I said, it's just your body's not meant to be throwing that many pitches at that speed with all that spin rate. But I think if you look at Garrett Crochet as a first-year starter, that's a worry to me. That's a worry to me because I think if you look at the Boston Red Sox and the way they stand right now, there's a lot of young pitching. I like Garrett Whitlock a lot. Had an arm injury this past year. He's going to be coming back, from his arm injury, and he'll be back in the Red Sox starting rotation, which we'll see what the rotation looks like. There's really nothing, planned out, too much as of now, since we're not even in spring training yet. That'll be something that we'll figure out in the next month. But they do have a lot of young pitching. Garrett Whitlock, like I mentioned, Cutter Crawford, Tanner Houck, Brian Bayo. That's a lot of young pitching right there, which is great. And Garrett Crochet is another young pitcher as well, which is awesome. But he was only a first-year starter this year, and I think the Red Sox needed a more veteran, top of the rotation guy. I would have went out and I would have gotten Corbin Burns or Max Fried, a guy that's been doing it for 4 or 5 years. Obviously, at the end of the day, when you have a guy that's pitched for 4 or 5 years, there's going to be a lot more wear and tear on their elbow and their shoulder, and I get all that. And that's probably some sort of a worry for the Red Sox. They probably want to go younger at the position, and that's why they ended up getting Garrett Crochet. But I think if you look at it, it's a little bit of a worry he's a first-year starter to me. Because at the end of the day, what happens if this year is a fluke? And I'm not saying it's going to be. I might be completely wrong. Maybe it won't be a fluke. And I hope it's not. I'm a Red Sox fan at the end of the day, so I hope it's not a fluke. There's always a chance, it could be a fluke, since it's only a 1-year sample size of him being a starter in the game of baseball. Which, it was a very successful year, and it makes sense that Chicago was going to trade him. They weren't going to re-sign him within the next 2 years. He was going to end up walking in free agency at some point, so they end up moving on from him. And obviously the Red Sox trade, a really good package over there, and I think this is a win for the Chicago White Sox. I really do. I think this is an excellent trade for them, with Crochet only having 2 years of control left, and only 1 year left, or only 1 year as a starter under his belt. That's an excellent return. I think that's an excellent return. But I think if you look at what the Red Sox gave up, it's a lot. I think moving on from Montgomery is really tough. I think Montgomery is an absolute stud. I think he has the chance to be a superstar in the game of baseball. And when I watch him play, I think he could be the next Mookie Betts. And I think with prospects, a lot of the time prospects miss. And that's why they're prospects at the end of the day. No one knows how they're going to pan out. And that's the major question. You have to be able to trade guys that high-end prospects like the Red Sox did and try to guess on which pieces were right to move. The Red Sox felt Montgomery and Taylor were the two better pieces to move and keep their 3 of their top 3 prospects with Anthony, Maya, and Christian Campbell. But I think if you look at what they gave up, I think Brady Montgomery is the highest ceiling of all of those guys. And that's a worry to me. I think he could end up being the superstar of that group. And like I mentioned, prospects are not always going to pan out. That's why they're prospects, like I mentioned. Most of the time, prospects do not pan out. That's why people want to go out and they want to get veteran pieces that are very established in the game of baseball. But Garrett Crochet has only been a starter for 1 year. That's a little bit of a worry to me, like I've mentioned. That's a worry. And I think Kyle Taylor's a very good player as well. Could have been the catcher of the future for the Red Sox. And I think when I look at Montgomery, I see a 4-5 tool player who's probably superstar upside, like I said. And at the end of the day, is he going to be a superstar? I don't know. But I'm watching play, I see superstar potential. I really do. I see superstar potential. So we'll see what happens there and how things work out for the Red Sox. Breslow had to go out and he had to get a top of the end rotation starter. He had to get a top piece. And I get that. He needed to get an ace. And I've been preaching that over the last year. The Red Sox needed more pitching. But I wish the Red Sox just signed Corbin Burns or Max Fried and they were able to save those prospects. And I know a lot of people don't like keeping prospects and just never wanting to give them up. And you might get a little greedy in trades and not want to give up a prospect that you need to give up to try to get a guy. You're not really going to fleece a guy like, you're not going to get a guy like Garrett Crochet and fleece the opposite team. That's just not how it's going to work. You're going to have to give up good pieces to go out and get a good guy like him. But I just wish they kept Brady Montgomery. I think he ends up being the best piece of that deal, and that's a worry to me. I think that's the guy I would have wanted to keep. And here are some numbers that I want to mention, which I didn't mention these. And they're a little bit, it's a little bit hard to understand these. If you look at these numbers overall, they can misconstrue the way Garrett Crochet played this year. And that's the thing. These can be not completely, an illustration of how he pitched at the end of the season. But in his last 12 starts, 5.12 ERA. That can be a little misleading, and I'm going to get to that in a second. 277 batting average against, with no starts over 4 innings. So the White Sox were essentially managing his innings at the end of the season, knowing he was going to get traded at some point. They didn't want to end up, getting him hurt and then hurting his trade value. And considering their record and his arm injury in the past, it made sense for the White Sox to do that. So the 5.12 ERA in his last 12 starts is a little bit worrisome. But I think if you dive a little deeper into that, it's not as bad as you think. 2 earned runs or less in 9 of those 12 starts, and only 1 earned run allowed or less in 7 of those 12 starts. So really only had 2 or 3 bad outings in that stretch of 12 games. And that's the reason the ERA was so high, and he's not throwing over 4 innings in any of those games, really. So that's the problem. If you're not throwing over 4 innings in any of those games, the ERA is going to be higher. With more outs you get, the ERA drops. He wasn't really getting that opportunity to try to get the ERA to drop. So that's why that sample size looks like a really high ERA. So it's a little bit misleading. And I think if you look at the stat that I've mentioned already now a few times, FIP, 3.38 FIP in the second half with a 2.22 expected FIP in the second half of last season. So that's really good numbers there in FIP and expected FIP at the end of last season. You want to be around 3. That's really good. 2.22 expected FIP is great. 3.38 FIP is very good as well, and you'll take that. That's going to be a very good piece at the top of the rotation for the Boston Red Sox next season. But like I mentioned, I think it's a very good deal for the Chicago White Sox. I really do. As for the Red Sox and what they did with the rest of the offseason, which I'll explain more at some point when I get a little bit more time. I'm not going to have too much more time here. I only expect it to be on for about 15 minutes. We're already 25 minutes in, so I thank you guys for listening. I do really appreciate it. If anybody's listening out there, thank you so much. But one last thing I want to mention was Walker Buehler, who the Red Sox just signed on a one-year, $21.05 million deal. That's the same qualifying offer that they actually offered to, it was Nick Pivetta. Pivetta ended up declining that, and the Red Sox ended up taking that same money and going out and getting Walker Buehler, who has a much higher ceiling than a guy like Nick Pivetta. And I love Nick Pivetta. I'm a fan of his. I think he has very good stuff. He can be a little bit inconsistent at times, but he's a guy that will go out there and give you innings every single night. When he's out there, every fifth day, he shows up and he does his job. If you need innings, he can go out there and chew innings. And he was very good out of the bullpen at one point for the Red Sox. And I think that was something that a lot of Red Sox fans look back at, and they do appreciate everything he did, because he was very good as a bullpen guy at one point. But I think if you look at Walker Buehler versus Nick Pivetta, I would take Buehler 10 out of 10 times. And I know he's been battling injuries the last 2 years, and that's a worry. And he had a 5.38 ERA in the 2024 regular season for the Dodgers. But he was excellent in the playoffs for the Dodgers. Excellent. He closed out Game 5 of the World Series on the mound. And in his last 3 postseason outings, all of these being with the Dodgers this past season when they won the World Series, he pitched in 10 innings, no runs allowed, 13 strikeouts, 4 walks, 5 hits allowed. That's excellent all around. Any one of those numbers I just mentioned, they are excellent. And I know there's a worry with his injuries, as I mentioned. 30 years old with an injury risk. But honestly, every pitcher nowadays in the game of baseball has an injury risk. And like I've already mentioned, it's an unfortunate part of the game of baseball. But there's an emphasis on spin rate. There's an emphasis on velocity. And that takes a major impact on your elbow, your shoulder. It's not going to be easy for pitchers to throw 100 pitches every fifth day anymore. It's not. With the emphasis on spin rate, pitchers are going to start going 4 or 5 innings like they have over the past few years. You're going to see more and more guys do that. There's not going to be many 7-inning guys anymore. There hasn't been the last few years. That's just the reality of the game of baseball, unfortunately. But there's going to be even more of a decline, I think, in the next few years with that. Because of the emphasis on spin rate and the emphasis on velocity, more and more arm injuries are happening. More and more Tommy John surgeries. And that's very unfortunate, like I mentioned. So that's an injury risk here with Walker Buehler. He's had injuries in the past. But he was excellent for the Dodgers in the playoffs. It was a big reason they won the World Series this year. I love this move by the Boston Red Sox. I really do. I think the Garrett Crochet deal was good. I think it's a very good piece to go out and get. Would I have done the deal? I'll be honest. I would not have done that deal. Even though he's a great piece, and you look at it, and now you have a top-of-the-rotation guy, a guy who had very good numbers all around, like I mentioned, with his whiff rate, with his FIP, with his ERA, and all that. He had some really good numbers overall. And I'm not denying that at the end of the day. I know he's a very good piece. And I know the Red Sox had to go out and get a top-of-the-rotation guy. And if you look at his strikeouts per 9 innings, expected FIP, strikeout to walk percentage, all of that's great. The whiff rate was great. But for the reasons I mentioned, only being a one-year starter and the prospects the Red Sox gave up, and I know, like I've mentioned now, you're going to have to give up prospects to go out and get a guy like Garrett Crochet. You're not going to go out there and get him for just a couple, bottom of the prospect pool players. You're not going to get that. You're going to have to give up some high-end pieces to go out and get him. But would I have done that deal? I wouldn't have. I'm a big fan of Brady Montgomery, as I mentioned. I think he's the highest ceiling of any of those Red Sox prospects. And I know everybody disagrees with me on that. And I've had some, arguments with Red Sox fans about that. And I wouldn't say arguments, more discussions at the end of the day. I always try to see the other side to every single argument, especially when it comes to sports. People are going to disagree at the end of the day, and that's just fine. That's the beauty of sports, right? We all see things differently at times. But I know Brady Montgomery didn't play in the minor leagues this past year because of a leg injury at the end of his college career. And I think he would have been a top 5 pick without that leg injury. I really do. But he ends up falling to the 12th overall pick to the Boston Red Sox. And he ends up being now a major piece in this deal. But I think a lot of people are looking at his ceiling, and they're just kind of disregarding the fact that he didn't play in the minors. So they're just basically saying, at the end of the day, the Red Sox just basically gave up an unknown. And that can be a good thing and a bad thing, right? You can look at it and say, oh, he didn't play in the minors, so we just gave up, a big prospect, but a guy we haven't really seen do too much for, a top-of-the-rotation guy in Garrett Crochet. So that could be a good thing at the end of the day. There's not really much film on him, so you might not be too worried about giving him up since he's a very big unknown. But at the same time, it goes the other way. He's a big unknown. You haven't seen him play. What happens if he tears it up right away in the minor leagues for Chicago? And that's a worry to me. I think he's going to be a major piece for that White Sox future. I really do. And they've really built things up over the last few years. The guys they've given up a lot of talent. And that's what you kind of have to do when you're in the position that the White Sox are in. You're rebuilding at the end of the day. You're going to have to go out and you're going to have to basically just rebuild that entire roster. You know you're not going to re-sign a guy like Garrett Crochet, so you go trade him to the Red Sox, and you get a very good prospect return there. You really do. And as I said, you're not going to go out and you're not going to get him for your 21st and 22nd prospects. That's just a reality. You're not going to go out and get Garrett Crochet for that. So the Red Sox had to go out, and they had to give up a big deal, and I get that. But at the end of the day, I probably would not have done that deal. And we'll see how things work out, like I mentioned, and hopefully things do work out for the Red Sox. But Brady Montgomery was my guy. I wouldn't have moved him at the end of the day, but we'll see how things work out there for the Sox. And the last thing I'll mention here, which before I move on, which I don't know if I have time to really dive into the Masataka Yoshida trade rumors and the Tristan Casas rumors, so I'll probably end up leaving in just a minute. But I want to leave with one more point here about the Red Sox. The last few years, the Red Sox didn't really spend much money, and that's just something that fans were upset with. You listen to 98.5 The Sports Hub, you listen to WEI, you listen to me here on the radio the last few years on WZBC. I've been upset with the way the Red Sox have spent money the last 3 or 4 years, and that's why I'm very concerned with the money that they've chose not to give out. They've made the decision to not go out and not spend, and that's a worry. They've really not given up much money the last 5 years, and that can be a worry when you look at guys that want to come and play in Boston. You want to come play in Boston because you want to think you have a chance to win. That's why Juan Soto went to the Mets over the Yankees. He said he thinks he has a better chance to win in Queens than he does in the Bronx. The Red Sox have to start spending money so that free agents actually see that the Red Sox are trying to win. Because when that happens, players might take a little bit less money to come to Boston. Big-time franchise, big history, one of the biggest franchises in all of sports, and one of the most beautiful ballparks in all of sports. Fenway Park is beautiful. You can get players to try to come there because they've always dreamed of playing at Fenway. So at the end of the day, I think the Red Sox have to start spending money, though. I really do. And this offseason was at least some progress. They were in the Juan Soto deal at one point. They were one of the 4 teams that were mentioned: the Blue Jays, Mets, Yankees, Red Sox. Those are the top 4 teams for most of the Juan Soto signing rumors. And that's the thing. That could be a good thing. The Red Sox were interested in them. But you don't want to be interest kings. You want to actually take the checkbook out and sign a big deal for a big-time free agent at some point. And we'll see what they do. They didn't want to do that with Chaim Bloom. As I mentioned, Chaim Bloom was a very, very good pickup for the Red Sox in 2019. And he was a scapegoat for ownership not wanting to spend. I truly believe that. And maybe things will change. Maybe John Henry will want to start spending in the next few years. And it seems like they were interested in Juan Soto. So at the end of the day, maybe things have flipped over the past year or so. But I just wish the Red Sox decided to spend with Chaim Bloom. Rather than making it all about bargain contracts, give Chaim Bloom the power just to go out and spend on any contract that he wants. Because he built the farm system like you guys wanted, and that was the main thing that the Red Sox wanted to do. They wanted to lower the payroll, and they also wanted to build the farm system while competing at the same time. And all 3 of those things are really tough. They're tough to do all at once, especially in a place like Boston. There's so much pressure on you to succeed in Boston. Boston is a very hard place to win, just like New York. Very hard place to win. That's why I mentioned Daniel Jones. Being a quarterback in New York that was drafted 6th overall out of a very small school when it comes to football, Duke, they're not a big historic program in football, and then you get that big contract, 4 years, $160 million. And I think it's a little bit misleading with that contract. Everybody thinks all 160 was guaranteed. Daniel Jones got under $90 million of that 160, which is still a good payday, but he didn't get all 160 like everybody believes so on the internet. But I think when you look at Daniel Jones and his time in New York, a lot of the pressure that was on him was not his fault. It wasn't. The draft status, the big contract, the poor surroundings, a ton of coaches, and head coaches, 3 of them like I mentioned already. And that's the thing. You can't blame Daniel Jones for the surroundings. He's not going out there and signing players and bringing players next to him. And the same can go for Chaim Bloom, like I mentioned. The surroundings weren't really his fault. And what I mean by surroundings, ownership didn't really want to spend in the Chaim Bloom era. So he was the scapegoat for them not wanting to spend, and there's a lot of pressure on ownership to make a move and get rid of him. But I think at the end of the day, that's a great pickup for the St. Louis Cardinals. The Red Sox loss and Chaim Bloom ends up being a major win for St. Louis. They get a guy that's going to rebuild that farm system and really rejuvenate that franchise over the next few years. So we'll see how things work out there for Chaim Bloom in St. Louis. Congratulations to Chaim on that contract. I met him this past spring in April. Met him at a BC baseball game. And BC was playing, I believe at that time, as Wake Forest. It was a big game. Wake Forest had 3 projected first-round picks. And all 3 guys ended up being drafted in the first round. And it was really cool meeting Chaim. Because you see him watching guys like Nick Kurtz, Chase Burns, and Siva King, 3 guys who were all top picks in the 2024 MLB draft. He was there to watch that team play, and he still took the time to talk to me for a few minutes, which I thought was really nice of him, and I'm always going to be thankful for that. Chaim Bloom gave me the time of day and talked to me, and I think that's what you should want. You should want to build a franchise around a guy that you want to work for, that you want to play for. That's why I think Chaim Bloom is the right piece for the Red Sox. Seems like he's a guy that people want to work for at the end of the day. And we'll see how things work out, as I said, in St. Louis. I've said that now 4 or 5 times. I mean, the future is always unknown. But when I met Chaim Bloom, obviously a very bright guy, but a really nice guy as well. So I'm wishing him all the best in St. Louis. Congratulations to him. And that's probably what I'll conclude on for today. I'll definitely do more episodes in the future. Maybe I'll do more live ones. I know I always want to get back into the studio and do a radio show again, so maybe I could do that this spring again. But anyways, thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen to this. It's much appreciated. I know my family was listening. That's probably the only people that probably are listening right now, since I just sent this link out, just about a half hour ago when I started this episode. But thank you guys so much for listening. It's much appreciated, and hopefully I'll see you guys back here in the WZBC studio very soon. Thank you guys. I hope you have a good night. Take care now.